thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm delighted to be chairing this discussion around The Forgotten Tribe. It's a book on British MEPs. We're here tonight thanks to the European Parliament Liaison Office in the UK, and IACES, which is the Irish Association for Contemporary European Studies. So my name is Viviane Gravey. I'm a senior lecturer in European politics here at Queen's, and I've been given the delightful role of chair. So before I introduce our panel members, I'm just going to say very few words around the book. I was delighted to be asked. The European Parliament is, as someone who teaches and researches the European Union, I guess my favorite institution. I guess, can you have favorites? I do, I guess, the European Parliament. Part of it is because I do environmental politics, and the European Parliament has played a key role in making the EU a bit of an environmental actor. And the members of the European Parliament are famously not well understood. And the role of the European Parliament is famously not well understood. Now, it's not just a UK problem. It's actually perhaps less of a Northern Ireland problem, because Northern Ireland is one of the rare parts of the European Union where people actually were able to name their MEPs. People knew who they were. I'm French. You ask a French person who their MEP is, it's very rare they can answer that, right? And that's a general problem across Europe. So it's a fantastic book to try to help make us understand UK MEPs, and in a way, I like to see similar books around the MEPs of other countries, because they also need a lot in terms of, reflecting on the roles that they have had. There's loads of chapters, and I hope you get to see the book. Actually, we have some QR codes here. So if you want the paperback, you have to scan this, and it takes you, you got 20% off tonight. Or if you want the ebook, this is here. You can get these after. But basically, I'm just going to try to whet your appetite a bit for the book. It tells you all about the story from the early days of the elected parliament, the directly elected parliament in '79 up to Brexit, how the different parties changed their perspective. And then something that I found is perhaps most original about the book is perspective on the European Parliament and on the British MEPs from different governments, from different institutions, from the media, and even then from their kids, which I think it's nice to bring the personal into the political here. We also have chapters on the different nations, and Giada Lagana, who's going to be speaking later on, has written, for example, a chapter on Northern Ireland. Now, perhaps what is missing for me in the book is a chapter perhaps on European Parliament presence, I guess, and British MEPs' presence in pop culture and how culturally they're perceived. And I think for a very long time, there was almost no presence for the European Parliament in our popular understanding of Europe. One quote that I think many of us have used overmuch, which is in one of the first seasons of Borgen, that Danish TV show, about how in Brussels no one can hear you scream, and how there is this tendency in lots of European countries to promote people to Brussels to forget them, so that they would not have as much of an impact on the national politics. Now, recently we've had a TV show that I'm really sad is not being shown in the UK, which is Parlement, which is a Franco-German take on that follows the life of a hapless French parliamentary assistant in the EP. It's a fantastic show. If you haven't seen it, I would strongly recommend that next time you're in France or Germany, where it is actually broadcast, you watch it. And it does give you a very interesting perspective on, I think quite a biased French perspective on the last few months of the UK presence in the European Parliament. So I'm looking very much forward to also hear what it was from someone who's actually experienced it. So tonight, our panel is fantastic. And it is first got David Harley, who has actually been editing the book and has written part of it as well, not just the editor, is the co-author of quite a few of these chapters. Long time working as a civil servant in the European Parliament, both for the Parliament itself and then for the Socialist Group. We have Dr Giada Lagana, who's a lecturer in politics in Cardiff, who has written extensively about the role of the European Union in the Northern Irish peace process. We have, of course, Jim Nicholson, who's been for a very long, for 30 years.
30 years.
30 years a member of the European Parliament for the UUP and for Northern Ireland.
Non-stop.
Non-stop is quite rare
Yeah.
for MEPs, considering the change in electoral systems and all of that. And then Carl Whyte, who's saving us at the last minute after Matthew O'Toole is sick tonight and couldn't join us. So Carl has very kindly accepted to join in and to present a view from the SDLP. So that's our panel for tonight. They will each have 10 minutes and I will hold them to that. And so David, over to you.
Thank you, Viviane. It's a great pleasure to be in Belfast at the start of this important anniversary year. 50 years since the UK, Ireland and Denmark joined what was then known as the European Community. And I don't have to tell you that it's also an anniversary year in terms of how we're approaching the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. So I will dive in. Over the next 10 minutes, I'll try and address probably about 4 aspects of this book. Some have already been touched on by Viviane. I'm going to be subconsciously thinking about MEPs and pop culture over the next 40 minutes, but I'm not going to immediately reply to your very interesting suggestion. I mean, it takes us into the space of communications generally, where I believe that quite a lot has been done to improve the situation, but it's never been easy. We can perhaps return to that. But so first of all, I'd like to say a few words about what gave us the idea of writing and editing this book, and then to go through the main themes that run through it, and perhaps see if we can find some lessons and pointers for the future, not just to look back, to see if by any chance there are lessons to be learned about the UK's wider relationship with Europe from the stories of these individual MEPs. I believe there are, but we'll see. So I'll be referring, naturally enough, given the title of the book, mainly to UK MEPs in general, but I have to pay tribute, first of all, to the MEPs over the years from Northern Ireland, particularly to Jim Nicholson, given the non-stop 30-year contribution that he's made. And Jim has not only been, I think, an incredibly effective MEP for his constituents in Northern Ireland, but he's been a very effective MEP in Brussels and a very active member of the Agriculture Committee, a quaestor, and has been a fully fledged, very active MEP over almost that entire period. And indeed, his colleagues and Jim himself, I believe, and I'm not alone in thinking that, have made an extraordinary contribution within the Parliament to laying the groundwork, preparing the way for the peace process and the peace programme. But Giada is the acknowledged expert on this subject. It's written an exhaustive and excellent book, so she will be saying more about the peace process in her presentation. But I think it's widely acknowledged that the European Parliament's work culture of compromise and seeking to build consensus was ideally suited to the pursuit of peace through economic benefits. And so it remains to this day. I would maintain that the European Union and the European Parliament still have a contribution to make to carry on the good work of the MEPs, starting way back with John Hume from the very first days. John Hume, coming from the cabinet of Commissioner Burke, already in the regional committee in the first months of his first mandate, knew how to work the system and to bring forward reports in the regional committee and into the plenary of Parliament. So why did we write the book? Well, my co-editor Diane Hayter Baroness Hayter and myself felt that we couldn't just let, in the phrase of Commissioner Tugendhat, we couldn't just let the waters close over the 351 women and men who had served their country and their constituents over 4 decades. Most of them, we'll come to the exceptions later on, had done a solid job of work, and at the very least deserve recognition and gratitude. You may have seen in the invitation to this meeting the eloquent words of Ivan Rogers, Britain's former permanent representative in Brussels, describing the MEPs. He said, "The EU as a whole benefited hugely from the expertise, the wisdom, the breadth, the temperament, the professionalism, the humour, and even the constructive, healthy scepticism of so many good British MEPs over the decades. Those contributions won't be forgotten, and the imprint on what the EU has now become is indelible." So what were the main themes over those 4 years? First of all, the reversal of roles, the extraordinary reversal of roles of the 2 main parties. When the 60 Conservative MEPs elected in 1979 first arrived, they were described by George Parker, the political editor of the Financial Times, as a Heathite tribute act. They were all incredibly pro-EU, pro-European community. And we know where they stand now. Not exactly recognizable from the classic type of Tory MEP in those early years. And Labour, of course, was exactly the opposite. Labour were infighting at each other's throats, almost physically, not only metaphorically, from those first years. And then gradually, thanks first of all to Neil Kinnock becoming leader, and then above all during the Tony Blair years, Labour took over as the most pro-European political party in the UK and certainly in GB. And then we had the second theme after the reversal of roles is the significance of the introduction of a proportional representation system in 1999. I believe, and I say it on some authority, that this was decided by Tony Blair in a fit of pique because he wanted to exercise tighter control over his party and the selection of candidates. Because out of the 62 Labour MPs who were elected in 1994, 35 of them paid for a full-page advertisement in The Guardian opposing the change to Clause 4 of Labour's constitution, the nationalisation of public industries. And they put this anti-Blair statement out in The Guardian the day before Tony Blair paid his first ever visit to the European Parliament. And it didn't go down very well. And from that day onwards, I think Blair decided that we had to have, and he was pushed in that direction also because it was a sort of principle of the Treaty of Rome that you must have a common electoral system. But that change to PR, which might have sounded like useful politically to Blair, useful in terms of getting on with his fellow heads of state and government, resulted in, for the first time, UKIP gaining 3 seats and providing a platform for Nigel Farage, and the beginning of that Eurosceptic trend in the Conservative Party, which I would maintain has, to some extent, taken us from that moment to where we are today. As regards the balance of achievements, I think the verdict has to be pretty mixed in terms of the collective judgment taking the 351 over the 4 decades. Individually, British MEPs played a very important role, a very constructive role in the institutional ecosystem of the institutions of the European Union from within the European Parliament. And many of the leading MEPs are cited in the book in terms of their particular contributions to specific policy areas. But I still cling to the words of the journalist Hugo Young, who said in 1998 that the UK, and in particular England and the Conservative Party, are still struggling to reconcile that past they could not forget with the future they could not avoid. And Young also maintained that Britain has a deep-seated problem of cultural identity. Of course, there are other factors at play, but I would suggest speaking here in Belfast this evening, that these questions of history and cultural identity have contributed significantly to the situation in which the UK and Northern Ireland find themselves today. Forgive me if I end with a literary quotation. We've tried to ensure that this book is balanced and objective, despite the sensitivity, obviously, of the subject matter. But with this kind of book, it's impossible to please everybody all the time. But the reality is that no account of a period of history can ever be totally complete. That view of history is supported by the characteristically wise words of the late and much lamented Hilary Mantel. She says, "History is not the past. It's the record of what's left on the record. It's the plan of the positions taken when we stop the dance to note them down." So that's what we've tried to do with this book, to note down the positions taken, to set the record straight, and with respect and admiration to pay our debt of gratitude to the members of that remarkable tribe who served their country and their constituency as the UK members of the European Parliament, and recalling in particular, here at Queen's in Belfast this evening, recalling in particular the practical and historic achievements of the MEPs who represented Northern Ireland.
A hard act to follow, not only because you did manage to say all of this in precisely 10 minutes. Giada, over to you.
Thank you so much. So first of all, I'd really want to thank Viviane and the European Parliament Liaison Office in the UK for supporting IACES in organising this event this evening, and to all of you also to be here and contributing to make this event a success. Grazie. And I think I have already told you and Diane a number of times, but I again want to say how honored I was to be asked to contribute to this wonderful book. And well, I hope I lived to the expectations. So first, it has been said, I am the author of the chapter on the Northern Ireland MEPs. And it needs to be said that I have reflected long on the angle to take. Particularly, I have reflected long on the actors to include in my chapters, and especially the actors that would feel comfortable in being part of a book entitled British MEPs. And secondly, and that's probably most importantly, I really focused on the story I wanted to tell. And this, I think, it's particularly important because no matter how much attention the Brexit process has attracted to the European dimension of the Northern Ireland peace process and all the literature that it has generated, there is still skepticism and too much, in my opinion, in recognizing that the European community, the European Union, had a part to play and played a part in fostering peace in Northern Ireland. So this is what my chapter mostly talks about. And tells the story then of the cooperation, the coordination and the bottom-up approach that the Northern Ireland MEPs have undertaken into the European arena, and that has as its most visible achievement the EU Programme for Peace and Reconciliation. So I started by suggesting that the early efforts to involve the European community in peace building in Northern Ireland was bottom-up rather than top-down, and originated in the activities of the European Parliament, which again was not something that was much recognized before, instead than the policies of the European Commission. And that originated into the European Parliament specifically through the lobbying of the Northern Ireland members of the European Parliament, starting with John Hume. So Hume was, to put it simply, and we all know it, profoundly inspired by the integrationist project's role in reconciling post-war Europe. And indeed, when he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize alongside David Trimble in 1998, in recognition of their joint role in negotiating the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, Hume's acceptance speech cited the European Union as its exemplar. However, as David already noted, even before he represented Northern Ireland into the European Union, Hume had begun to forge links and connections with important actors within the European political elite. And his networking started with its role as political advisor to Ireland EC Commissioner for Transport, Trade and Administration, Dick Burke, and allowed him to build knowledge of and connections across a wider European space, of course helped by his fluency in French. But when I go deeper in the chapter to explore this networking, what I really wanted to emphasize was that nothing would have been as successful as it was without the support of the other Northern Ireland MEPs. Hume's colleagues, so first Ian Paisley and John Taylor, and then Jim Nicholson that is here with us tonight. And also what I want to point out, again, David has already said it, but because I took this specific angle in the chapter, I talked probably of a fraction of the work that Jim Nicholson has done into the European Parliament, while he was active on many areas and not just focusing only on Northern Ireland, while that was mostly what Hume did. So, how this joint work was possible? Well, on that I would like to reflect that on the fact that in the early 80s, the European Parliament was the sole forum where elected representatives from both parts of Ireland, from Northern Ireland and from the UK could sit and work together, thereby taking the edges off their conflicting views on the situation. Organized in political groups rather than national delegations, the European Parliament established itself as the first political arena where actors could overcome some of the usual obstacles to engagement associated with the Northern Ireland conflict. And the evolution of the European Parliament from direct election in 1979 was also influential in generating processes of interdependence, transnational relations, and common goals among the main Northern Ireland actors. And the first common goal had economic development as its main focus, which was used to open the way towards a political influence in the region coming from the Commission in the 90s. And this opportunity, the window of opportunities arose in following the ceasefires in 1994 to maximize also the EU responses to the ceasefires. And here again, the Northern Ireland MEPs presented a united front in front of Jacques Delors, asking him, if I can say that, to take a step further. And to date, the most visible, the most tangible results of such cooperation is the well-known, well-established EU peace package, which is specific for Northern Ireland. It has many issues, particularly connected to its implementation, of course, and also connected to how probably overcomplicated it is to work within the European Union bureaucratic machinery. But again, what I want to put the accent on is that the package is an important validation and endorsement of the joint work of the Northern Ireland MEPs within the European Parliament and within the European arena. It created a political space, a new political space for new developments, bringing politicians and wider civil society groups to work together, to take ownership and responsibility for the administration of the European resources. And it exemplifies the focus that the Northern Ireland MEPs wanted to place on civil society, and they need to address their needs first. It also embodied the concept of bottom-up approach to peace building, which gave the people of Northern Ireland an active part to play in their own peace process. And I think this is also where the legacy of that joint work survives, in the peace programs, which are the only EU financial programs surviving the challenges of the Brexit process. How they interact with the institutional settings initiated by the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and by the way in which the European Union has learned to respond to Northern Ireland local initiatives by facilitating them and by trying to connect them to peace-building development. Connecting to a point you made, David, about a lesson to be learned. I'm sure there are lessons to be learned in here on how to make things better and how things could be improved. But also, I think that the processes that I have just highlighted do constitute a lessons, and to repeat them, interdependence, transnational relations, and common goals. And more than anything, the importance of having everyone around the table of the negotiation when discussing constitutional change. Because negotiation could only benefit from an atmosphere in which all opinions remain open, all prejudices are kept in check, and constitutional changes are explored in light of what worked and what went well in the past. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now, the first half of the panel, we had civil servant, academics, well known for keeping to time, but now we are moving to the politician half, and I'm not sure, but I'm sure it will be fascinating. As someone, again, who studies European politics, having someone who's been a member of the European Parliament for 30 years next to me I'm very looking forward to what you'll be saying to us, Jim. So I might give you a bit more than 10 minutes, but please don't tell the other.
Thank you very much indeed. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be here this evening, and I want to congratulate those who actually took the time to produce this book. I suppose the truth is a lot of us who were MEPs didn't think we were worth actually making a book about. When you look back on it, and I have actually read it, and I can recommend it. There's some very interesting parts in it, and David referred to them, especially at times by the former UK representatives in Brussels in charge of UUP, Ivan Rogers and John Kerr, are well worth a read, believe you me. In 1989, and I missed the first 10 years of the Parliament, but in 1989 I was elected to the European Parliament. It was then the EEC. Then it became the EC, and now it's the EU. And that's the transition period that it's gone through. There were 15 member states. Then it went to 28, and now they're 27. And it could enlarge again, and that'll be for the future. But at that time, the Parliament had no power. You did your work in committee, and the best you had was influence. And I was there with two other MEPs, both who were political party leaders at home, Dr Ian Paisley and John Hume, well known. And I always described myself as the child. Can't do that anymore. The child between the other two. But anyway, I have to say, we did get on well. We worked together, always in the best interest of Northern Ireland PLC. That was always our bottom line, Northern Ireland PLC. John and I and Ian were on the regional fund committee, the regional committees, and regional funds was the big thing at that time for Northern Ireland, because there was no money. And regional funds, and there was a thing called additionality, which was a major issue, because the UK Exchequer in London creamed off the money that was for Northern Ireland and said it was theirs, and they actually argued that they sent it to Northern Ireland in a different way. And that was a major argument as far as we were concerned. The one thing, Agriculture, of course, Committee, I served on that for 30 years. And that was very fast changing over that time. But the one thing I learned very quick, coming as I was myself, as a farmer, I realised that the Common Agriculture Policy was good for the family farm. It protected the family farm and not the big industrial farms. And that was important. But the one other important thing that I had to learn very fast was, in the European Parliament, no one has a majority. You had to learn, as David has said, how to compromise and find consensus. Now, you'll appreciate in 1989 as a unionist going from Northern Ireland to Brussels, that was not the easiest thing for me to do. But I did. I learned very fast, because you either had to learn or sink. So I learned very fast how the system works. But it was a fast learning curve. And David referred a number of times to the influence of Brussels. And all the committees in Stormont, if it was working, if it was working, would be elected by the Hunt, i.e. your strength in the Parliament. And the Hunt has its total, everything comes from Brussels as far as the Hunt is concerned, and that is probably the biggest influence it had on the situation here. And as we sit here tonight, and as I drove into Queen's University through the side gate, and no security, no nothing, it's hard to believe back in '89 and into the 90s that this place was riddled with bombs, shooting, murder and mayhem. And the one thing I never missed in all my time as an MEP was having to stand up every month and expressing sympathy to the families of people who were murdered over the last month. And that violence, thank God, has gone and has left. And it was after that and during that time when the first ceasefires came in Northern Ireland that the three of us went to see the then Commission President, Jacques Delors. And it was quite a momentous occasion. It was covered by media. It was recognised because, as you said, Professor, Northern Ireland was the one part of the UK where the people actually knew who their MEPs were. And they knew what we were doing. And we went into Delors' office, and he simply said to us, he welcomed us there, and he said, "Gentlemen, how can I help you?" And we said, "You can bring and give extra funds to the people of Northern Ireland, all the people of Northern Ireland, but from the bottom up, so they'll see that it's helping." And he said, "Yes, I will do that." And his official said, No, Monsieur Delors, you can't do that." He said, "There's no line in the budget." And civil servants sitting here from Brussels will know you can do nothing in Brussels if you haven't a line in the budget. So he said, "I'll take it out of underspend." That's the man Jacques Delors was. Never before was there a better president of the European Commission, and I don't think I can safely say there hasn't been a better one since. And I will always remember him with great, a man of great standing during that time. And as we left his office, was in his office, as always, even in those days, as we left in his office, the second ceasefire happened during the time we were in that office when the UVF announced their ceasefire. Now, as we sit here tonight, this is not a real big thing, but back in those days in the early 90s, folks, in 94 and 95, this was major to the people of Northern Ireland, that we're maybe on the road to peace. So that was a great time, and I have to say that during that time, that's what started the peace funds. I don't know how much money Northern Ireland got out of the peace funds, but I know it's way over $2 billion. I know that a lot of people said to me it was a waste of time. You tell the people, the little groups. I met people who were 10 people from Dungiven who had a group of people with impaired vision, and they got £1,000. And that was life to them. It helped people right across this province that I will never know, never meet, and neither did any of my other two colleagues ever meet. But that is what we were actually doing. And I want to pay tribute at this stage. That was the beginning. And we all know the period has been very fraught with difficulty. There's been good times and bad times. And my friends in Brussels would say to me, "Jim, how long does it take you to make peace in Northern Ireland?" That's a long time ago to now. We still haven't done it, so you can understand why they asked the question. But Europe stuck with it. Europe didn't run away. And the rest is history from that time to now. But I want to pay tribute when I'm here tonight, because lots of things are forgotten about. The three MEPs each appointed one person to represent them on a body to actually make sure the peace funds actually worked. And many people up and down, right across Northern Ireland, came together in the peace funds, in those funds in those days, giving their time for nothing. They didn't get to claim expenses, they claimed nothing, giving their time to get the peace funds off the ground. They were unrewarded, and they certainly deserved an awful lot more credit than they actually got. And they were the real foot soldiers for the MEPs at that time, making sure the peace funds actually took off, because there was a lot of people on two sides of the community were actually hoping the peace funds would fall on his face, and they made sure it worked. And I want to pay a tribute to one other person at that time, and that is Dr. Monica Wolfe-Matisse. She was the Regional Affairs Commissioner, and she brokered a very important agreement between the three MEPs and the Republic of Ireland, whereby it was 75% of the funds went to Northern Ireland and 25% went to the Republic of Ireland. And it was she who brokered that in my own home city of Armagh. And in actual fact, the Northern Ireland office and the UK direct rule ministers never believed that the three of us could find the agreement, but we did, because we put Northern Ireland PLC to the forefront. John and I also went on and we tried, by the time they brought in the Cohesion Fund, we tried to get the Cohesion Fund extended to Northern Ireland, and if that had happened, we would have had motorways all throughout Northern Ireland by now. Unfortunately, it didn't, because they wouldn't agree that we were going to create such a precedent for the rest, and it didn't happen. But the three MEPs, I have to say, we were the voice of Northern Ireland at that time, and we worked together, all three of us. We worked together. And a story, we always met every Thursday in the old Parliament in Strasbourg, when we met on Thursday for votes. We met in the morning about 10 o'clock, 15 minutes before votes, and then we had a chat about the different things were going on, the different representations we were supposed to make, and where we'd have joint meetings and how we'd organise them and do things. And as we were standing, the three of us talking together, you could see the people walking around us, circling around us. Look at these three boys from Northern Ireland, they're going to create the next Third World War or something, you know. And it never happened, but you could see them actually watching us. And those were things that we actually, to some extent, I suppose, enjoyed. Right, I'm in trouble now. But I have to say, and I'll cut it short, 1998 brought the difference when the executive came into place. The First and Deputy First Minister became the voice of Northern Ireland, not anymore the MEPs. So Europe was moving on. Europe brought in the euro. We had 11/9. The world was changing. There was no longer an Iron Curtain, but there were new problems. And I'm not going to go into them if you want to question me on them, because I've got my 2-minute deadline here, so I'll try to keep to it. But I want to go on now and deal with, that was the first half where I said we didn't have any power. But in 2009, we got co-decision. And co-decision meant that members of Parliament no longer could stand up and say, I want, I want, I want, without having to say how you pay for it, how you pay for it, how you pay for it. And therein became the big difference as we went forward. And we became a real voice in the decision making if you wanted to be. I watched Europe. I've watched the referendums, I've watched everything, I watched Nice, and all the things that happened. And Europe is extremely careful, and maybe we'll get on to in questions, and I'll not deal with Brexit now, but during my time in the Parliament, I was very privileged to have been chair of the Australian-New Zealand delegation, to be chair of the US delegation for 2.5 years in the United States, where met which was the Parliament's liaison with Congress. I was in the United States with my two vice chairmen. One was Harlem Desir from France, and the other was Bastien Belder, for a Dutchman. And the three of us were in Congress, and we knew we were in. It was the time the war broke out. The first war broke out in the Gulf. And we were there at that time, and it was the time when there was a lot of anti-EU in Europe when they had stroked out French fries and put in freedom fries and things like that. But we were walking across, and who come walking down only across the point? Only Colin Powell. Colin Powell, who was then the Secretary of State. And we went up to him and said, "Hello, Mr. Powell, how are you? We're from Brussels, we're from the European Parliament." And Harlem Desir said, "I'm from Paris, France, my name is Harlem Desir." And he had a great laugh about it, and we had a good time there, but it was a very interesting time doing that. And as David referred to, I spent 5 years as a quaestor, which is basically, a lot of people haven't a clue what it is, but you're basically the members' trade union representative in the Parliament. I spent 5 years on the Bureau of the Parliament, and I learned that it's the David Harleys of this world who run the Parliament, not the members of the Parliament, that they really know how to do it. Him and Julian Priestley ran the place very well at that time. So, and I'm only joking, David, don't worry. But yeah, you're right. Thanks, David. That's how things were. But I will finish up now fairly speedily. But the EU has changed. The EU will continue to change. With or without the UK, that was going to happen. During Brexit, I suppose I witnessed probably the worst part of it, but I spent a lot of time with Michel Barnier. And the only thing I'd say about Brexit would be Michel Barnier's biggest victory was keeping the 27 member states united and not in any way becoming separated at any time during those negotiations. And I'll be happy to say some more about that later on. As I said, probably for me, at that time, if you look back, David Cameron decided to leave the group of the European People's Party. And I was part of the British Conservative delegation in the Parliament at that time, and joined with what was then the ECR group. And that probably was the catalyst that began the exit, the leaving of the Parliament. For me, the ECR group coming was a good thing, because I became the agriculture coordinator, and coordinators in the committee representing the different groups had power. You decided where the reports were going, who the rapporteur was, what you would take, what you would leave, what you wouldn't do, here you do there. You did the deals. I remember George Lyon was, in the first 5 years, was the Liberal coordinator, and Albert Dess and myself, the three of us, we had 50, and Paulo de Castro, the socialist, we had 70% of the votes on the Agriculture Committee. So we decided what happened in agriculture. And for those 10 years, they were the best 10 years of my life in the Parliament, for that was the 10 years I had some power. But but I really enjoyed that, and I have to say, the co-decision made a thing. I was out in Brussels in December at the former members, and I met the Agriculture Commissioner, and I was brought into a meeting he was having, and I was reminded that the Nicholson dairy package is still going well in the rest of Europe. It controls the dairy sector in the whole of the rest of Europe. And if anybody's very keen on novel foods, I was also the rapporteur of that, and it was the Nicholson package that actually did that. The one thing I don't miss from that is the trialogues. For they went on to about 2, 3 and 4 in the morning, and anybody that was ever involved in that was the real difficult part that we had. But the one thing I would like to say in finishing is, I can safely say that for those 15 years, in the first 15 years I was in the Parliament, that John Hume, Ian Paisley and I, we boxed way above our weight for Northern Ireland. Thank you.
This was a very short summary of 30 years.
Did my best.
Carl, over to you.
Okay, what an act to follow, Jim, and it was good to hear about your time with John and obviously with Ian Paisley. I've stepped in at the last minute. I am a former policy director for the SDLP and also a North Belfast councillor, and I was coming over here thinking about the first time I met John Hume and the first time I campaigned. Actually, the first election was 1999 European election. And he came to my school in 1997, St Malachy's College, which is in North Belfast, just the year before the Good Friday Agreement. And I think what Jim has done here very effectively is actually, we're always very focused on the present time, and I think here we forget what it actually was like. I think for some people in the room here, I'm just looking around, like some of you were maybe not born or very, very young during those times, and this all affected us. Those years affected us all personally. And I think the older you get, John Hume would have celebrated his 86th birthday last week, and I remember exactly where I was when I was told that he had passed away. I also remember as a 4-year-old in this area, my grandmother was actually killed by the UVF in a bomb on University Street. So that day of the ceasefire sticks out in my mind as well as a 14-year-old. And I think for a lot of us, we forget in the sort of day by day, blow by blow, tweet by tweet, Nolan show by Nolan show, actually what was achieved back in '98. And also something came through in the Brexit discussion that actually the European Union had nothing to do with that. But I think your book, David, and Jim, certainly what you've said there, rubbishes that notion and actually underpins the value that the European Union and the input of our 3 MEPs and John had on that. Sean Farren, our former minister, is here, and maybe John, at the end, you can offer some input in, because you were an executive minister for the SDLP at the time, so it's important that we hear and understand that role as well. Now, that's the nice bit. I'm going to say in the book, I don't know what John Hume would say if he was here in a book called British MEPs. I see in your chapter you quoted Seamus Heaney, which is good. Heaney obviously had the very famous line about his passport being green when he was awarded a British prize for poetry. I saw Paul Mescal, the famous actor from, what's the film he was in, After Sun and Normal People. He's now been described as a British actor last week in The Independent and The Guardian, even though he's from Sligo. So, yeah, I think John fits in the definition of, he certainly was a UK member of the European Parliament, but he definitely was not a British MEP. You've mentioned in the book, and it was good to see the speech about the bridge at Strasbourg. He also gave a speech which is on YouTube about, and it was in French, Ce Parlement est le Parlement de l'Espoir, which means this Parliament is the Parliament of Hope. And I think that what Europe showed and what John effectively did was, John was very good at internationalising our conflict. He understood the supernatural nature of institutions and how that would actually lead to a sustainable peace settlement. He also understood, and I think Europe played a part, you mentioned the hunt there, and that became a key part of the Good Friday Agreement, the consociational nature of actually solving conflict and building a society that allows us to do that. I think his reach as an MEP, when you think of his the reputation he had in Europe, the work he did in Europe, but also the work he did in the United States, I think there are very few, if any, political figures from that era. I think he definitely meets the definition of what a statesman was. And I just want to go back to that about hope in a minute, that he actually he built those bridges, he crossed the Atlantic, he crossed the Irish Sea, the English Channel, and there's very few people before or after him have managed to do that. And what impact did that have? I read a book recently, David Goodall wrote a memoir of the negotiations of the Anglo-Irish Agreement. And now I wouldn't put it top of your Christmas stocking list for anyone who wants to, it's not a page turner, but it's a very detailed account of the negotiations of the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which is an interesting and sort of forgotten stepping stone that got us from the sort of serious years of the Troubles right through to the Good Friday Agreement. And actually a consistent theme in that book is the influence the SDLP and the influence the SDLP had in Washington and how that was through John Hume. And he understood that international nature and how important it was to do that. And then he did it with Europe. Jim, you've talked about peace, the peace funding, the Simon Martin report, she was a French MEP, and it's mentioned in the book, and how that led to hundreds of millions of pounds in Northern Ireland and the border counties, and we've seen there's another tranche of funding. I think it's $1 billion itself, Jim. So when you tot them over the years, you're into the mid to high billions, and we can't. The impact of that has been, and Jim's given a good example there of the example you gave. You can't count it; it's incalculable, right across society, small and large, and it's bottom up. So it's people in their own areas deciding and going out and actually finding projects that need funding and making sure that they get the money. He delivered a message of hope. He did that throughout his political career. There's a quote in the chapter there where I think, yeah, he's tough as nails. He certainly was, and there was no nonsense. He didn't take any. There was no, quarter given, no quarter asked. He was a tough negotiator, and he's the architect of I think much of the peace settlement that we have here today. And I think what's interesting with this discussion is what's coming out is the economic benefits and actually real life examples. So you listen to the media debate that we're subjected to every day now. All the problems that you have, health, roads, traffic, education, they don't get the attention they deserve in debate. Whereas the MEPs that we had, and I know this isn't Chatham House rules, and I'm certainly not going to pay tribute to, other political parties, but it's very clear they work together. They work together effectively, and they delivered solutions for all of us here. As I told you, the first time I met John, I was in school, and I joined the party that day, and that's 25 years ago. I spent a year in Johns Hopkins University in Bologna, which is in northern Italy, did a master's in economics there, and on the plane over, by complete coincidence, John and Pat were travelling to Bologna, Italy to speak at some sort of European event. I can't really remember what it was. And me and my naivety thought, God, well, they know where they're going when they get off this plane. We're in the middle of an airport outside, northern Italy. I was talking to them, and the guy who worked for the European Parliament was there as well. And I said, he's okay, when you get a taxi here. Of course, when I arrived there, they were greeted like, heroes, whole entourage for them. And it really struck me that this was a man from Derry, someone who I'd canvassed with, had been lucky enough to meet and be, walk alongside, giving out leaflets. He wasn't looking for my advice or anything. I was just lucky to be there. But even in Bologna, Italy, a city there's no real Irish connection there. There's nothing significant, no significant links. He was well known. His message had travelled, and he was greeted and welcomed like the hero that he was. I suppose I'd just like to end by going back to what he said about hope, and I think that's something that we've lost in our politics, or we're at risk of losing. I do think that we, and it was Jim, it was poignant to hear you talking and reminding everyone about what we actually went through here, what we achieved coming up to 25 years ago now, this April. I can't believe that it's 25 years since the Good Friday Agreement was signed, and also the potential that we haven't reached. And I felt like that's a document that has saved a lot of lives, but a lot of potential was lost from it. And I think that the work of the MEPs that we had in various different ways and at various phases, I think, in their political career, and I'm thinking of Ian Paisley there, they all understood that message, and they took it forward, and it was spread across Northern Ireland. But I think now we're at the risk of losing that, and that's something that I don't want us to lose. And if anything, if the book achieves anything, it will remind us all of what is possible, and we all know it. I have more in common with somebody from the Shankill Road than I do from Dublin or London. Everybody feels that. We're all from Ulster or Northern Ireland or the North, whatever it is. And when we work together, even though it looks like we might be starting World War III, as you said there, we actually can achieve a lot. And I think the book recognises that. And well done on putting it together. And I think the authors and editors deserve a thank you for that. So thank you.
Again, we started on time, we're finishing the panel on time. This doesn't happen like that at academic conference, so I'm really, really impressed by the panel tonight, and also by the contributions, of course. I'm going to now open the floor for questions. And there's a question already at the back. If you can introduce yourself when you ask a question. And then, thank you.
Hi. Is this on?
Yes, it is on.
Hi, I'm Frances Nielsen. I'm a third-year PhD student here at Queen's. And I'm looking at the attitudes of Conservatives towards Northern Ireland during the Brexit referendum and both the negotiations. And I'm just wondering, there's been a lot of talk about John Hume and his contribution in lobbying the nationalist voice within the European Parliament, and then also there was a brief mention of his lobbying in Irish America. But I was actually just transcribing one of my interviews today, and one of the points that came up was that during the Brexit negotiations, the unionist voice was almost lost, and that Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, was seen as speaking for Northern Ireland. And I was just wondering whether you could expand a bit on how the unionist position was sort of conveyed to Europe and the then subsequent impact of that during the Brexit negotiations.
Okay. I think, was there another question we can get? Yes. Oh, yeah. Yes. And then, okay.
The EU in recent years developed its kind of own kind of foreign policy and its own foreign policy for kind of what the EU would move forward with that. And I was just wondering that it's more of a question to Jim Nicholson. Do you think that if the EU had been more proactive politically, that peace would have come earlier to Northern Ireland?
Yes, and one more here.
Yeah.
Francis Jacobs, I worked 37 years in the European Parliament, so I'm really interested in this panel and in the book. Three quick questions. One is, Jim was very eloquent in talking about how, especially before the executive was set up in Northern Ireland, how the three MEPs worked closely together. And I could see that Paisley, for instance, was much more pragmatic than his reputation, and they worked very closely together. But how important, first question, how important was it to be in a political group? You, Jim, were in, obviously, the EPP and then the ECR. But I think the DUP is unique in the European Parliament in never, ever having joined a political group. How important was that? Second question is perhaps a more general one, and that is, to what extent do people change their views, MEPs change their views in the course of their careers in the European Parliament? My impression was that some arrived passionately pro-European and remained it. Others were passionately anti-European and remained it. I'm thinking of people like Bob Cryer and others. But others sometimes even came as Eurosceptics and gradually evolved. And I very much like your impression in how people changed over time within the European Parliament, maybe by being influenced by their groups and so on. And the third question is, one very striking thing about the British MEPs, I haven't got the figures, but how many of them went back into the House of Commons or the Lords, and quite a large number of them became ministers. To what extent did their time in the European Parliament influence their subsequent behaviour as politicians? And I'm particularly thinking at the moment where the Secretary of Northern Ireland is Chris Heaton Harris, who was 10, 15 years an MEP? 10. Sorry, a bit long.
Okay, so we have 5 questions then. The first one on how perhaps the unionist perspective and the unionist voice got lost in Brussels during the Brexit negotiation, and how, in a way, the success of the Irish diplomatic service there in terms of getting that representation. A question that is more of a what if the European Union that is currently developing its foreign policy, if it had done that a bit earlier, would we have seen its influence in Northern Ireland and perhaps a peace process in Northern Ireland earlier? And then a very geeky parliamentary question that I'm very happy to hear. The importance of the political group. As we've heard, the European Parliament is the only parliament where we have representatives from different countries not sitting by their national groups, but by party political group. And yet the DUP decided not to join any political group. Now then, moving on to another key theoretical understanding for us. As academics, we all have this idea that there's a socialization effect, that you go to Brussels and that Brussels changes you. Does that happen in practice? And finally, how was it such a good, how good is it for your career as a British MEP to go to Brussels, and how it shapes you after that in terms of House of Commons, House of Lords, or become a minister? Usually, from a French perspective, it's usually a really bad thing to be sent to Brussels, but perhaps for the UK it's quite different. So, who in the panel wants to go first? Shall we start, and if you want to just pass and move on to the, there will be other questions that you may be better placed to answer, but David, is there anything you'd like to say, or do you want to?
Well, I can always find something to say, yeah. And,
but you don't have to.
But I will in this case. Even though I think most of the questions, and if I could say possibly the more interesting ones, were addressed to Jim. But my brief this evening is not only to sort of talk in general terms about life in the European Parliament or the EU, but it's to try and bring things back to a certain degree about what's in the book. One of the main themes of the book is the reversal of roles of the two main British parties. And the fact that if PR had not happened, then perhaps a lot of things would have changed. So I think the Conservative Party and the Conservative MEPs, given that Britain joined the European Economic Community under a Conservative government and left the European Union under a Conservative government, the Conservative Party in the UK has to take full responsibility or full credit, depending on your point of view, about what's happened. And that was also to some extent reflected in the European Parliament. As has already been said, that David Cameron's pre-election, before his election as leader of the Conservative Party, he did this, in my opinion, rather disreputable deal. Jim would probably disagree, so I apologise, to take the Conservatives out of the European People's Party, the EPP group. And I think that was also the beginning of the lack of credibility of the British Conservatives in Europe. It was very badly taken by a lot of leading European politicians. And the British Conservative Party remains, and I say this in all objectivity, the only mainstream centre-right party in Europe that has taken this extraordinary attitude of hostility towards the European Union. And let me add one further personal consideration. What is absolutely staggering for me personally is the degree of ignorance and disinterest expressed at the highest level of government in the United Kingdom about Europe. And I would include prime ministers and senior civil servants. Ivan Rogers, who mentioned before, mentions in the book that for senior civil servants, the institutional setup, the decision-making process of the European Union was beyond the ken of most British or UK politicians, with the exception of Northern Ireland. And so ignorance and disinterest played their part. They played their part in the change of attitude towards Europe. The Conservative Party played their part in the way the Conservatives changed groups. And I just wonder if disinterest and ignorance doesn't strike a chord with some of you here in Belfast tonight.
Okay. Giada, anything to add?
The first, yours, Francis, about the importance of sitting in a particular political group in the European Parliament. Now, I will speak from the perspective of an academic. Of course, I am absolutely terrified of saying anything wrong and then being corrected. So just to know, it's very daunting to sit in this panel. But I think that for the experience of someone studying it, it was key for Hume, for example, to sit into what was at the time the largest political bloc into the European Parliament. He started, when he was elected, acting really in the front row of the socialist group, acting as the treasurer. And from what I could understand, sitting in the same group with people like François Mitterrand or with the German Chancellor, that listen to you, that sign the motions for resolutions, it is a powerful, subtle instrument to bring something to the European agenda. Hume understood also perfectly that another way of actually catching the attention of the institution was showing this joint approach that was possible in that particular arena. And so he was able to bring Paisley, Taylor, and also then Jim acting as the chain, as he said, in doing this work for Northern Ireland, starting with the Martin Report, which Carl really mentioned. That was the first major report that was signed within the European Parliament, and the first time that really the attention was on Northern Ireland. And this point actually brings me to the question that was asked in terms of would the European Union brought probably peace a little bit earlier if some of the developments within the EU were happened earlier. The people in the panel can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think so. And it was because the European Union didn't take naturally an interest in Northern Ireland. It was asked to do something. It was asked by the Northern Ireland MEPs. It wasn't something that came naturally. Actually, people and in the parliament, in other groups, were against almost it. And so I don't think that it would have happened earlier if developments within the institutions would have happened in a different way, because again, it was to the merit of the Northern Ireland MEPs and to the people that brought the attention there.
Thank you very much. Jim?
Yeah, that's a raft of very interesting questions, and I'll try and cover them. I agree with what's just been said. I don't think the peace process would have happened any faster because Northern Ireland people and the political parties had to be ready for it at that time. And I think the timing was just about right on that. As far as the unionist input was concerned, well, unionists were depending on the United Kingdom permanent representation to represent them at the discussions and the UK government. I would have spent probably every month, had meetings with Michel Barnier. They were confidential meetings. He was a highly honourable man, a man of the highest discretion. I have utmost respect for him in every way. I didn't always agree with him, let me say, but I still give him credit. There is no one had any, he and I sat and discussed the situation that we are presently sitting in here with the protocol. And let's be straight about it. And we recognised all those years ago this was going to happen, and how we worked to see how we could avoid it. And there was no way it could be avoided because of the hard Brexit. And when Boris Johnson was persuaded by Leo Varadkar to turn the backstop into a front stop and have the protocol in the Irish Sea rather than using their brains, and if they had to do any separation of food going to the Republic of Ireland, do it on the Scottish side, not at Larne. You know, I went through that Brexit period when I listened to certain politicians, some in my own party, and let me make it very clear here now because I might be monitored here by my own party here. I'm speaking personally and not on behalf of the Ulster Unionist Party when I say what I say. To those who said, let's get our borders back, all they did was move the border from between Newry and Dundalk to Larne. So what achievement did they make? What did Samuel Wilson achieve in that? So I just wonder when I look back and what I think. But that I sat with Barnier for hours, and we tried to find different ways. But he had his job. His job was to represent the 27 other member states, not the United Kingdom. And unfortunately, and to this day, which we recognised was going to happen, is that Northern Ireland, under the protocol, will be following EU regulations, but without any input. And more importantly, and especially in agriculture, they will not have the generosity of the Common Agriculture Policy to actually pay for the standards to which they've got to produce food if they want to put it into Europe. So there was many things wrong with that. Leo Varadkar is right. There were many things wrong. There were people on missions doing different things at different times. And yeah, I think if we had to go back, I have to be honest with you, and I have to say openly, I'm not a fan of referendums. And I think if the United Kingdom is going to go forward and deciding the future of the United Kingdom, they have got to look at how they do referendum, because the referendum and Brexit didn't work. And let's everybody take an example of that. I'm saying nothing more on that. But that's my view on referendums. So I would also say, you ask a very interesting question. I spent an awful long time deciding where I would how I would deal with Brexit. I went with my then party leader, and we had MPs at the time, to 10 Downing Street and met David Cameron. And after a long discussion, I had to say to him, I said, Prime Minister, where's the border going to be? Do you not realise Northern Ireland is the only part of the United Kingdom that has a land frontier with the European Union? Do you know what he said? Stranraer. He wasn't far wrong. So that's the thought that went into that situation at the time. I'm sorry, but that's the reality. And I get very frustrated when I look back, because it didn't take it wasn't rocket science to realise that we're going to be in the position we're in today if we actually went forward with the protocol in the way that it was. Because everybody has rights. The EU has rights, UK has rights, and Northern Ireland, the people of Northern Ireland have rights. But the people of Northern Ireland and all the people of Northern Ireland are being used to a large extent by Brussels and by London. Each are using Northern Ireland as the piggy in the middle to try and get wrench more out of the other person. And, if you look at the present political situation, if you were sitting in Brussels and you're looking at the UK situation today, wouldn't you just sit and wait and say, well, I don't think we'll do too much to these Tories leave. They're going to go with the next election, and then we're going to get Keir Starmer. So we'll deal with him. He might be a different person. So are we going to have to wait another 2 years in Northern Ireland before we get this problem solved? When I was out in Brussels, people that I know well in Brussels, and I was in the commission at the topmost level, and they were saying to me, the Northern Ireland Protocol is a very small problem in the whole overall situation of the European Union. Yes, it's very important to Northern Ireland, extremely important to Northern Ireland, but for goodness sake, I would appeal to both sides and to everyone, get it solved. Francis, you ask another very interesting question. I had to, as I said, rest with my mind, and I did. And I came to the conclusion that I'm a unionist, and I'd make no apologies for that. I believed the union of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland was stronger with the United Kingdom inside the European Union than outside. And I think I can stand and I can ask anybody, I can challenge anybody, you can say to them, challenge me on that. The union was stronger inside. I was clear on that. And that is why I looked at this from the head and not from the heart to a large extent. And do people change? Yes, they do change. Of course they change. You cannot but change. One of the things I did, and it's something that I would recommend, and I know a lot of organisations in Northern Ireland go. I visited the Somme a number of times. And you cannot visit that area and not but feel and look and feel and understand what the people in 1914 went through. And I always remember Winston Churchill saying, Joe was better than war. And he was right. So if never again, if we didn't do anything else good by being in Europe, we made sure that never again we have another situation, and you only have to look no further than Kiev to see what happens when things go badly wrong. If we did nothing else, we did good. We kept the peace. We have that peace in Europe, and I hope it lasts a long, long time. But when you go there and you see those graveyards and all those, and I want to pay tribute, the War Graves Commission, they do a magnificent job. And it didn't matter whether you were Paddy from Maharafelt or Billy from Portadown. You were dead on those fields at the Somme. And that was the reality. So, yes, I suppose I did change. Yes, I travelled a long way. 30 years is a long time. But look, people tell me about all the things that was wrong with Brussels. I'm sorry. I can tell you all the things that's wrong with Stormont. You don't have to go to Brussels. I can tell you all the things that's wrong with Westminster. I can tell you all the things that's even wrong probably with the Scottish Parliament. Look at the US Congress. Look at the President at the moment. He's having trouble with all these papers he's taken away. And look at the previous President. He had the same problems. Tell me where you haven't got a problem. If you've got a problem, fix it. And that's the way to move forward. And I honestly believe UK played a massive role in Europe, because UK on many occasions took the position of the hard position when others simply stood behind their backs. And now you're seeing that it's the Danish, it's the Austrians, it's the Dutch who have to come out and say, no, we can't do this. They don't have the UK to do their dirty work for them anymore. And that is what has changed in the whole things of Europe. So, I have many good friends in many different countries in Europe, and one of my German friends says, we'll never forgive you for leaving us here, and please don't forgive me this, leaving us here in Brussels with the French. So there's also the other thing I learned in Europe was never tell a joke across a language. It never works. It doesn't work. You get in terrible problem. And people coming back, those interesting ones come back. Heaton Harris is here now. A previous Secretary of State was also an MEP. Theresa Villiers. Theresa Villiers was an MEP. I remember Chris Huhne, he was a Liberal. Former Deputy Prime Minister, Liberal, was also an MEP. Nick Clegg, you have Robert Goodwill. A lot of members went back. Yes, I think it did, because I think David made a very important point, and I think people will be astounded by it. And it's the one thing that I found during the Brexit. I found that UK government ministers, I never took any pride in watching my government being outmanoeuvred, outsmarted, outflanked during the Brexit process. I never took any pride in that, but that's what happened. There was lots of things that the UK government could have done more to actually firm their position. I even had UK government people coming to me saying, could you intervene with some people to get us a meeting of another nationality? They couldn't even get that. And that is where Barnier very, very shrewdly, along with Juncker, they very shrewdly held the 27 together. Now, we may not agree with that, but that is what they did. And we are where we are today because of that. Because Barnier was such a shrewd negotiator, because he actually travelled around the member states and kept them all involved and kept them all up to speed. And he went to London and he tried to get London involved and tried to change things that at least had a soft landing with Brexit rather than a hard landing. And unfortunately, folks, we've got a hard landing, and this is what we're trying to deal with and find a way through. And believe you me, I know Europe well enough. There will be a way found. I don't know how long it'll take, but there will be a way found. There will be a solution. And we look back, if God spares anybody to be here in 10 years' time, and we wonder, what was it all about? So
we have 8 minutes left, and I'd like to get a few more questions in.
I'm going to be relatively short. I think there's 3 questions. The first one on the voice, Irish government voice versus UK, the voice of, was that a voice for nationalism or Northern Ireland, and where was the voice for unionism? I think we have to remember that, the UK government was in a confidence and supply agreement with the Democratic Unionist Party, and I think one of the things we haven't discussed, or you sort of, skirted, you did, was that, you cannot, and when we do look back in 10 years, there will be a chapter on the strategic errors that the DUP made, and they are yet to be fully understood, but we understand one of them, which was the voice of unionism was forgotten about, and sensible unionism by the DUP in that process, and the damage is what we're living with and having to deal with today. I think the DUP secretly, despite what they say in public, hoped for a hard border on the island of Ireland. That's what they wanted, with a sort of wink and a cute little, oh, we'll say nothing and this is what will happen, and completely misunderstood the significance of that, and the fact that just was not going to be an option, and not an option for the British government either. But also, you've got to remember, and I think, Jim, you've sort of you've referred to that maybe indirectly too. The Irish government didn't want to see the UK leaving the European Union. No, they didn't. They lost an ally. They worked together on a lot of issues, and even the language was something they had in common. And I know since then, Ireland is a small player in the European Union. You've talked about France, Germany. It was France, Germany, and the UK, and now Ireland had a very close ally as one of the top 3, and now they're gone, and that's very, very difficult. So I don't fully accept, I suppose what I'm saying is that unionism didn't have a voice. I think it did, and I think the problem was what that voice was saying was just completely wrong, strategically inept, and very damaging to every single one of us in this room. I should have mentioned it actually, you asked about the groupings. For the SDLP, the Party of European Socialists was actually very important. We became an active part of that group because of John being elected as an MEP, and it really did, and I go back to the secret of, one of the secrets of, I think, the success of John Hume as a statesman was internationalising the conflict here and understanding how by bringing strengthening links with countries, governments and parties in the US and across Europe, that he could do that. I've learned a lot from PES colleagues. I've travelled to a lot of these countries, met other socialist parties, and that's because of the links that he forged as an active MEP. Finally, the final point is, I think that's a good question about the European Union, one to ponder. If they'd be more proactive at a political level as opposed to an economic level, would we have seen a peace process earlier? I don't know, it sounds like a potential dissertation or something. But they definitely did spot, but that was because of John, the Simon Martin report, Jacques Delors and the MEPs. They understood the economic importance. We never had a Marshall Plan here. Our economy was completely broken, largely in many ways still is. You look at our productivity, it's really, really poor. You don't hear it a lot, but the ESRI had a report last week, it was December, because I was sitting in Amsterdam airport on a Monday morning reading this report with my head in my hands. There's a 40 to 50% difference in productivity north-south, and no one is really doing anything about it. And we've never looked at those problems, but the EU definitely spotted a long time ago with the Delors package and what's come since then in a way that others haven't. We're sitting a week or two after a damning report of Invest Northern Ireland and its performance. So you've got to remember, in some ways they are, they were, early adopters, or they were seeing things before other people were seeing them, and that was to be welcomed. So. Okay,
thank you very much. Any final comment? Yes. So I'll go here and here. Yeah. So Sean first.
Thanks very much. My name is Sean Farron, and I'm here as a member of the John and Pat Hume Foundation. I chair the board of the foundation. It was launched over 2 years ago now to commemorate the work of John and Pat Hume, and I suppose in particular to commemorate the work that John did in Europe. And John, I suppose, Jim, I'm sure you'd agree, at least I hope you will, that John, of the 3 MEPs, was the most pro-European before he ever went into before he was elected. he was steeped in European culture. He was a fluent French speaker. He taught French and history. And I remember, I'm old enough to remember John's first European campaign. It came, as we know, in 1979, at the end of a terrible decade of violence here in Northern Ireland, when politics just seemed to have been sidelined and there was no great prospect of any progress. And John, in his election, sought to raise our horizons beyond our dreary steeples and, as Carl has said, to internationalise to the extent that he possibly could our situation so that Europe would pay attention. And right from the very beginning, when he went to Strasbourg after being elected, he set out a programme which consisted of what became the Martin Report on Social and Economic Development, the Bureau for Lesser Spoken Languages on the cultural side, and a range of other issues. And he brought the European representatives with him in achieving progress on all of those issues. And one story that John frequently quoted was that when he went to Strasbourg first, he walked across the bridge from Strasbourg to Kehl on the other side. And he reflected that several decades previously, the people on either side of that bridge had been at each other's throats in the most destructive, cruel, barbaric war that had ever been visited on Europe. And on that day, they were meeting within the European Parliament, working on a peaceful, democratic basis to try to improve the lot of the people that they represented. And he wondered, was there any prospect of us bringing that level of cooperation back to Northern Ireland? I think he did, but maybe he didn't bottle it enough and bring it home and sprinkle it right across Northern Ireland so that our politicians today would be imbued with the same commitment to cooperation as he felt existed amongst the MEPs gathering, representing at the time, was it 16 or 18 nations after the cruelties and barbarisms of that war. So I think tonight John would be cheering what Jim was saying about his experience and the level of cooperation that they did achieve between the three of them. And can I finish just with one question, which is to do with the roots of Brexit? I often wonder, did the European Union sell the UK short when David Cameron went to conduct the renegotiations? It often seems to me that they didn't go the extra mile in order to ensure that the UK would not take the step that it eventually took. I suppose it's one of the imponderables of history, the what-ifs of history. But it does seem to me that perhaps when historians are assessing how rapidly the UK electorate turned against Europe, even though the margin at the end of the day was fairly slight, nonetheless, not even Farage expected or indeed believed that the noes would have it. But they did, and I often wonder why and how do they reach that point.
Okay, and our final question, Emma.
Hello, Emma D'Souza, writer and campaigner. Jim, you had mentioned people in Northern Ireland having to be ready for peace. And I suppose I was thinking about the role that civic society played in Northern Ireland in getting people prepared. The work that was done within communities, across communities, in the run-up to the peace process, and the important role that civic society played. If you look at things like the Initiative 92 or the Upsell Commission report, there were lots of ideas and pathways and solutions in there, such as parity of esteem and Northern Ireland Bill of Rights. These were things that then made it into the Good Friday Agreement itself. And yet we're in a situation where we currently don't have voice for civic society in Northern Ireland. We have the Civic Forum, which was part of the Good Friday Agreement and has been dormant since 2002. And I suppose maybe it'd be good to get your view on whether there might be a key to the challenges that we currently face in civic society, and how might we harness those ideas? Because it's not that we have an absence of ideas in Northern Ireland, but rather that we have an absence of the correct structures and frameworks to harness those ideas. And as a second question, could I also ask about increasing Northern Ireland's voice in the European Union? Of course, Northern Ireland voted to remain, and we have a hell of a lot of European citizens that currently live here. Yet we don't have a voice in Europe anymore, and perhaps more can be done to increase that voice. I'm thinking about the fact that there's only one Northern Irish rep on the Parliamentary Assembly Committee, and maybe Ireland could do more to include Northern voices. Thank you.
I'm going to ask people to respond quite quickly to the question, and considering that a lot of that discussion can continue over the delightful food.
Very quickly on Sean Farren's question, did the EU sell the UK short in David Cameron's negotiations? I think just David Cameron played a very inept role in those negotiations, and I think he was sort of bamboozled perhaps by the EU. But I don't think that he came with a very coherent set of priorities, and he never believed that he was going to lose the referendum. And I wish we'd had more time to talk about the fact that it was never inevitable, in my opinion, that the UK would leave. But we can discuss that over drinks. And very definitely, to Emma there, I think that we must try and find ways of including Northern Ireland voices at every possible level in future negotiations and activities between the EU and Ireland.
I'll be very quickly on the Sean questions. I completely agree with you, but also I think that from the European Union perspective, they weren't ready. It had never happened before that a member wanted to leave. So also from the European perspective, they, let's say, didn't know exactly how to handle the situation, and they did well to protect their own interest, as Jim has several times highlighted. And in terms of civil society and the voice of civil society, I think that within the mechanism of the peace programs, that was one of the ways to try to give and to provide the civil society their voice and a vertical channel of communication with the European Union institutions, and also, as I said, their active part to play in the peace process. And I think that one big absent from the whole Brexit process debates is the Peace Plus program, how this is going to be handled, how this is going to continue in this setting, and we don't talk nearly enough of it.
Jim?
Well, Enda Kenny, who was Taoiseach at the time when those negotiations were going on, is famously supposed to have appealed to Angela Merkel and Jean-Claude Juncker to give David more to fight with. And I think there's an element of truth in that. But I think we also have to, we in Northern Ireland have a different view. This decision was not made in Scotland or Northern Ireland. It was made in England. Right. Yeah. And there was lots of other things going on at that time. I do not believe the people were voting purely on getting out of Brussels. They were voting on immigration. They were voting on all sorts of manner of, on the government of the day and everything else at the time. That totally, which goes back to my point, if you're going to have a referendum, be very careful how you actually control it. So I think the jury's out in that one, and no doubt the history of when papers are produced in 25 or 30 years' time, we will know what was done and what was said, just like the same happens here in Northern Ireland. But I'll have to say this, UK will never, ever again have as good a deal as they had with the opt-outs and everything else that they had, but that's another point. Ready for peace? It's a good question. Hard to answer, but there was lots of things happening. I was even part of it. I was chairman of the party at the time. I remember going with Jim Molyneux to Washington, which was part of the choreography of a build-up to what actually happened, and meeting Al Gore in the US and the government. There was lots of people involved in that. What I would say at this moment of time, I think there's a major problem having a Northern Ireland voice in Europe. That is it's a democratic deficit as far as we're concerned. I have to say, I once famously made a speech, there was banner headlines in the Belfast newsletter, Dublin does not speak for Belfast. And if you try to make Dublin speak for Belfast, you'll only make the situation worse. So I wouldn't go down that road if I were you. So I think we've got to be careful. The most important thing that we need in Northern Ireland is to get the Assembly back up and running. Now that's easy to say, harder, much more difficult to deliver. But we do need it back, and that would certainly solve a lot of the problems. And to say to Francis, I always never regretted being in a group, because you cannot be an expert on everything in Europe. That's the first thing I learned. And being in the group, you have the opportunity in groups to hear what's going on in the environment, to hear what's going on in the international world, to hear what's going on from the experts in those groups. So I always benefited from it. And yes, I would say yes, being in a group is what you've got to be. Because you've got to be part of it, get on with other people.
And on that note.
Okay, I don't have a direct answer for Sean's question, but one thing just here in the comments is we have a New Ireland Commission, and part of that has been us going out and talking with members of PUL, Protestant Unionist Loyalist communities privately. And there's definitely a sense among people previously, they thought London knew what they were at. You know, so maybe Belfast or Stormont didn't know what they were at, but London knew what it was at. And I think that has actually really changed now. To a worrying extent where there's a confusion about identity, real uncertainty about the pathway forward. I happen to believe the polls that show referendum would fail. I think that is I think those polls are correct. I don't buy into this thing that you know it's very close at the moment. But I think there's a lot of people out there willing to be convinced and willing to be spoken to, because they've lost confidence and lost a sense of place and self. And that's not something any nationalist or advocate for United Ireland should be proud about or happy about. We have to work with people that are our neighbours. The other question, what was the other question again? Oh, the civic forum. Yeah, there should be a civic forum. It's a simple answer. We saw in the South citizens' assemblies how effective they are. Why isn't there one? Because Sinn Féin and the DUP want to control everything and don't want other voices coming through with good ideas that will then be implemented. That's the simple answer and reason why there's no civic forum.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. I just remind people that you have here QR codes to get the book. And there's actually even 2 paper copies here, so you can, if you have cash, you can ask the author over there. And thank you very much. Round of applause again for our panel members.